W. Bush. Watch our live coverage all this week on C-SPAN and cspan.org, or listen with the free C-SPAN radio app.
Over the weekend, Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard visited New Hampshire, the first state in the nation to vote in primary elections. The trip adds speculation that she's considering a run for the White House in 2020. She took part in a meet and greet with Rockingham County Democrats yesterday. This runs about an hour and 20 minutes.
To reiterate what George said, aloha. I'm feeling the aloha today here in New Hampshire. Has nothing to do with the cold, wet outside. The aloha, and this is the beautiful thing about aloha. No matter where you are, it always brings out the warmth in all of our hearts. And I always like to start conversations with aloha for that very reason. You know, a lot of visitors to Hawaii see and feel how aloha is often used as a way to say hello and goodbye. But the real meaning of the word is so much more powerful than just that. The reason that we greet each other with aloha is to recognize that interconnectedness that we all have. Ohana, exactly, family. That we are all brothers and sisters, that I'm coming to you with aloha, with respect, with compassion, with love, regardless of our ethnic differences, racial differences, maybe the way we choose to worship, or if we choose to worship, who we choose to love, how we live our lives, all of these things that too often segment us into different boxes. This aloha recognizes that we are all brothers and sisters. And with that aloha, with that love and with that care and compassion that comes with that, then that drives us to action, to seeing how we can best take care of each other. How can we best take care of this planet, this place that we get to call home? So when we have this foundation of aloha and love, then we have the power to truly come together as people, as Americans, and to think about how we can find solutions to the challenges that we face, to deal with the threats to our brothers and sisters in a whole variety of ways, whether we're talking about healthcare or whether we're talking about the threats to our planet. When we start from this foundation of aloha and we're inspired by this love, then we can truly have that strength and that power to be able to take on the tough challenges that are before us. Like so many of you, it is painful and disheartening to me to see the direction of our country today, to see how much divisiveness and hatred is being fomented by those who wish to tear us apart, based on things like our political party, the color of our skin, who we love, or the way we worship, the things that make us unique and diverse as a country. And they are using these things for their own selfish gain. And we see this in politicians who are trying to foment this hatred and divisiveness to get more votes. We see it in the media by those who are using these tactics to drive up their ratings. We see it in the big corporations who are driving this forward for their own greed, for their own selfish purposes. And the commonality through all of this really drives at home what the problem is, what the source of the problems are that we're facing as a country and as people, where we have people in positions of power, we have leaders and influencers who are abusing those positions, not thinking about the impact and the consequence and the well-being of the people and our planet, our future. And this is where, by recognizing the problem, then we can begin to seek and find the solution. Always keeping at the forefront what matters the most. Our families, our communities, the people of our states, people of our country, and this special place that we get to call home. I first ran for office in Hawaii when I was 21 years old. I ran for the state house. They laughed at me then too. Said, "What are you thinking?" I was really driven by a desire to be of service to my community and to my state, and to really bring to light issues that were not being addressed. As a teenager, I started to get involved in I guess you would call it activism. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I was really concerned about our environment. You know, Hawaii is a beautiful place, as is New Hampshire here, and I was concerned about actions being taken both by people and leaders who were not respecting or taking care of our home. It wasn't about politics per se, it was just about taking care of our home. I ran for that office. It was a crowded, open primary, and I made it through and got elected, and I'll never forget what happened the day after I got elected. I had gone through that race knocking on every voter's door in that district 2.5 times, and was honored and privileged to have earned the trust of the voters of the 42nd House District in Hawaii. And the next day, I was standing on the side of the highway with one of my yard signs that had a sign on top that said mahalo, means thank you in Hawaiian, to say thank you to the people of my district for giving me their trust and honoring me with their support so that I could work for them. Sign waving is a big tradition in Hawaii that is essential to anyone who wants to run for any office. And I was standing there alone on the side of the road as the traffic was slowly crawling by when I saw some activity in the passenger seat of a car coming towards me. And it caught my eye, and there was a woman who had written a note on the back of a file folder with a Sharpie marker. And I saw as she shoved this note in the windshield with her eyes peeking over, catching mine, making sure that I saw her. And what that note said was, "Don't let us down." I've never forgotten that moment, because that's what it's about. This is why we fight. This is who we are fighting for. And this is the gravity and the responsibility that we all share. Yes, those who run for elected office at every level, but each of us in our communities, because we know that in order to make the kind of change that we need to see, it takes every single one of our hands, our hearts, and our voices, motivated by this love and aloha, to take action and fight like hell for each other, for our future, for our home. And so this is where the answer lies. This is how we stay focused. This is where we draw our strength from to take on those who are leading and dividing and tearing our country apart, driven by hate and selfishness and divisiveness, casting this dark shadow that we have the power to overcome, motivated by love. We hear oftentimes, I do anyway, people who say, well, that's great, love sounds good, but love is weak. How do you take on these big corporations? How do you take on Donald Trump? How do you take on those who are undermining who we are as a country? Not recognizing that there is no force more powerful than love. There is no force more powerful than love. And we don't have to look too far back in our history to see shining examples for us in leaders like Nelson Mandela, who showed us through his words and through his actions and his example how to lead with love. Dr. King, who showed us through his words and his example and his life how to take on those forces of darkness and divisiveness and hatred and violence by combating them with love. We remember how he shared with all of us, inspired all of us for generations, that darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only love can do that. That hatred cannot drive out hatred. Only love can do that. This must be our rallying cry now more than ever, because this is the solution This is how we come together as Americans. This is how we come together as people and draw from love that strength and that courage and that fearlessness that we need to take on those forces and those obstacles that can seem insurmountable, that can seem too great to overcome. We see examples of the courage this love provides in a parent whose child begins to wander across the street, and what they will do to put their life on the line to save their child's life. I've seen personally firsthand examples of this in my brothers and sisters in uniform who put their lives on the line, willing to sacrifice everything out of love for our country, love for the principles that we hold dear, love for each other. We see this courage driven by love, motivated by love in our first responders, our firefighters, those in California who've been putting their lives on the line to save the lives of others. We can see examples of this in our everyday lives, of how we draw this courage and strength from love, keeping that at the forefront of what we are doing. And it is driven by this love that we fight for things that are near and dear to us all. We all know people who are sick in one way or another who need health care. We see threats to this health care and those with pre-existing conditions happening now. Inspired by love, we fight for our brothers and sisters to make sure that they get the care they need. We fight for those who are suffering from a broken criminal justice system and a private prison industry that is profiting off of keeping people in this cycle of incarceration. We draw strength from this love to fight against the big pharmaceutical companies, the insurance companies, those who are influencing the policies that are being made in Washington right now that serve their interests and hurt the people that they're meant to help. Pharmaceutical companies who are continuing to perpetuate and proliferate our streets with these highly addictive opioid drugs that are devastating people's lives. We find the strength to take on big fossil fuel companies, big defense contractors. We can go down the line of industry after industry after industry. We are seeing selfish interests benefiting and people suffering. And it is only when we, the people, gather together to take on these interests, to hold leaders accountable, that we can start to see that shift in priorities that put our people, our planet, and our future first. And so that's really where the ball is in our court, where the future is in our hands, our collective hands. It's up to us to make that choice, to be the change. It's up to us in our own relationships, in our own conversations, whether we're having them with people we agree with or disagree with, to choose love over hate, to recognize that we can disagree without being disagreeable, that we can have respect, and we must have respect for those who have a different idea or a different approach or come from a different place. To lead with that love in our hearts, recognizing that that is what binds us together as people. And this is how we build that path forward to a brighter future. It's up to us to choose that inclusion and that love, to fight like hell, to defeat that darkness, divisiveness, and hatred. Understanding that when we do that, there is no challenge too great for us to overcome. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming today. Aloha. Thank you.
Now we're going to do questions and answers, and I'd like to do this in an orderly way. I'm going to take several names of people, and so I don't have to keep calling on folks. And I would ask that you get get to the question, okay? We don't need speeches. That's for the candidate, okay?
Larry,
yeah.
there's a ton of people out here. I wonder if we could just open the door so that
we can scoot over a bit.
Okay.
You packed the house.
All right.
Here, let's do it.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right. Yeah. Okay. Great.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Well, Larry, thank you for
There's
calling
a
on
little
me.
bit more room in here if you want to come in.
Okay, Ken, you're first. What's your name? Nancy. Okay, Gary, you're third. What's your Isaac? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. What's your name? Robin. Okay. Do one more.
Hope you're not in a hurry.
Linds. Linds.
And Larry Cunningham, from out here, has a question too. I'm gonna add him.
Larry Cunningham.
I'm sorry.
Hi, Larry, it's Ed.
Oh, Edward.
Oh, Ed.
Edward.
Okay, Ed. All right. So, okay. So look, we're going to go into 4:45. All right. Remember.
There's a football game tonight, I hear.
Yeah. Okay.
About a half hour.
That's right.
Okay. So Ken, go ahead.
Thank you for coming, first of all.
Thank you very much.
One of the good things about living in New Hampshire is we get to do this. You've touched upon it. I think every decision in this country seems to flow from money. And I'm just wondering whether or not you are willing to, or prepared to maybe make some radical moves to try to reduce or eliminate the influence of money in politics, whether it's elections or the money flowing to existing incumbents.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm going to start with public financing. Do you think it has any hope?
I think there's some potential. I think the bill that we're introducing in Congress, H.R. 1, begins to tackle that challenge in a few different ways, and I think there are some others that we need to look at as well. Public financing is one thing. I think the immediate low-hanging fruit really is something that you all can do to help bring about that change, is to create the new standard for elected officials to not accept lobbyists or PAC money. We've seen a number of newly elected members who've just gotten elected in November who have made that commitment throughout their campaign and who are beginning to change the standard for leaders in Washington. So I think that's something that that doesn't require legislation to happen. Citizens United and ending Citizens United continues to be an issue, and now that Democrats are in the majority in the House, we have the opportunity to put forward legislation that we've never been able to bring to the House floor before to address that. But you mentioned something that I think doesn't get talked about more often, but it should, which is the other modes of corruption that exist within Washington, where leaders and elected officials are able to benefit financially and in other ways based on their influence on legislation and policies. One example of that is the Stock Act that was passed and then slowly repealed and weakened in many different ways, making it still possible for members of Congress to own stock and purchase stock directly. They could benefit from. Good example. And there are others. So there's some anti-corruption legislation being introduced in January. I'm working on another bill that addresses some of the things we've talked about, that addresses the revolving door that we often see between those in government, whether they are elected or not, and how they flow through making decisions, making policies, and then going and working either for the industries or the contractors who have benefited from those decisions. These are things that we really do need to address to stop the flow of the influence of big money in our politics and the decisions that are being made that serve those interests rather than the interests of the people.
Do you consider that one of your priorities?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. All right, Nancy?
In our recent congressional election, there was a candidate, a woman, who did not win. She moved to the state 2 weeks before she declared. There are a lot of things wrong here, but she had been a Marine, and it seemed to me that she was fighting an all-out war here. And she made a TV ad showing her prowess with a military rifle, and then at the end saying these don't belong in schools or something. I was appalled, and Seth Moulton, whom I have regarded very well, who's been up here before, was going around with her and campaigning for her. When asked by the news why he was doing this, he said because she was a Marine and he was a Marine. And he said Marines have an unshakable primary loyalty to each other, and he wanted more of that in Congress. I am now very concerned by the number of candidates who are running who have been in the Marines, because I personally want my congressman's primary and really only institutional loyalty to be to this district, not to some other organization. And I also am aware that the founders of this country worked hard to craft a government that was civilian, not military. You have been a Marine. Please, will you comment? You've been, what? Army. I've never been in any of it, I'm sorry. But, yeah.
Sure.
Comment on this.
Well, I will speak to my own experience. I enlisted in the Army National Guard in 2003, driven largely by what happened on 9/11, wanting to do my part to serve our country and to serve the people of my home state, and to do that through the National Guard that allowed me to do that, to respond to natural disasters at home and serve our country, to defeat those who attacked us on 9/11. I've deployed twice to the Middle East and continue to serve in the National Guard today. Coming back from both of my deployments to the Middle East is largely what drove me and motivated me to run for Congress, to be a voice of influence to stop our country from continuing to wage perpetual counterproductive regime change wars that are so costly to our country, to our men and women in uniform, and devastating for the people in these countries that we have waged war. I appreciate and respect the service of every veteran, wherever they come from, however they served. As elected leaders, it is important to know where they, like everyone else, stand on these issues that are critical to us and our country. To assume that those who have served our country all believe a certain thing and fall lockstep on any issue, I think is a wrong assumption to make. So as all of you have done here in that congressional race, it is your opportunity, and I would say responsibility, to question those who are running, veterans and non-veterans alike, on where they stand on these issues. In my own personal experience, and amongst many veterans who I've had the chance to get to know through my own service and across the country and in Hawaii, I've seen time and again how more often than not, veterans who have seen and experienced firsthand the cost of war are those who fight hardest for peace. This is not theoretical for us. It is something that is very real. And that's what's driven me as a member of Congress, what I have been fighting for and what I will continue to fight for.
Okay. Gary.
I have a very practical question for you, and that is when Joe Biden was a senator and vice president, he would just get on the train every Friday and take it to Delaware. Now, you can't take the train to Hawaii.
Unfortunately.
So how are you able to get around the practical difficulties of the distance between Hawaii and Washington?
That's a great practical question. I get back to the district in Hawaii usually at least a couple times a month. And so what that requires is, on average, about a 12 or 13 hour airport to airport commute. When I land, I guess I get the benefit of getting 5 or 6 hours back because of the time change. But what then happens is I wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning because it's time to wake up in Washington. So then I get to go surfing with the sunrise and then start my day after that. It's a commute, no doubt. But how many of you have been to Hawaii? Good number of you. You'll know, and I think you'll understand what I'm saying, where as soon as you step off that airplane and you breathe the ocean breezes coming across the airways, our airport's very open, then you kind of forget that you were on the plane for 13 hours. And you look forward. So I'm grateful. Hawaii is such a special place, and I'm really grateful to call it home.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Isaac.
So Gary's question was actually basically my question.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you a harder question, which is ask you your thoughts on the crisis in Israel and Palestine and how to get away from 50 years of occupation and nothing happening besides for violence.
That is a complex question that requires peace, being able to have those conversations to build a path towards peace. And the short answer really is, unfortunately, with the current leadership in place, they are getting farther and farther away from the possibility or the path, building that pathway towards peace and towards that two-state solution, recognizing the respect, the equality, and the humanity of all the people who are living within that region.
Okay, Robin.
Hi.
Hi.
So, Ma'am, I retired here last year after 33 years active Navy and 3 Pentagon tours. And I wanted to say, if I could, to her, please, there is intense loyalty with Marines and the veterans, but if that's at the expense of the people that we're all taught to serve, there's something wrong, and that is an exception, I really believe.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, so I've also had a brother who served in the Middle East. I deployed in the Middle East. You know, I've come home 21 Marines less than we deployed with, and so I really like your stance on the foreign policy. I'm probably familiar with far more than I want to be.
Yeah.
And I know that it's not necessarily a party issue, that there's a problem on both sides. And how do you work towards that? I know you've worked with Dennis Kucinich and Bernie, and there used to be a set of Republicans that tried to go and do some things, and I don't know how you get past whatever level the problem is at.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your service, and thank you for coming back and finding other ways to continue to serve. You're exactly right that this is not a partisan issue. This is an issue that affects every single one of us as Americans, and it affects the planet, affects people around the world. There are Republicans who I work closely with who are of like mind and who share this worldview and who are willing to put themselves forward in the fight for peace, even if it may not be that popular thing to do. One example is Congressman Walter Jones, who's a Republican from North Carolina, who openly shares and talks about how the greatest regret of his life that he carries with him every single day was that he voted for the war in Iraq. And his regret for casting that vote and carrying personally the cost of that and who has paid the price has driven him to fight so hard for peace and to make sure that we as a country, that leaders in this country, don't continue to make those same costly decisions. So there are others of like mind, both in elected office, activists and leaders and organizers within our community. But this is a question that I hope more people bring to the forefront, because it is too often swept aside as just one of many issues. The fact is that as we talk about the cost of war, it is not only our veterans who pay the price for that. Those who make that ultimate sacrifice. Friends of mine, people I served with who never made it home, whose families never got to say goodbye. Veterans who did make it home, but who are dealing with wounds that are both visible and invisible. Those who survived battles overseas only to come home and lose that battle with those invisible wounds and take their own lives. Yes, our veterans pay the price when leaders in our country decide to go to war. without thinking through the cost or consequences. But also the reality is every single one of us pays the price. Since 9/11 alone, we have spent trillions of your taxpayer dollars to pay for these regime change wars, these unnecessary wars of choice that have been counterproductive in every single way, making it so that we don't have those resources to address the very real and urgent and pressing needs of the people in our communities right here at home. This is something that we need to challenge the leaders of our country with, the decisions that they're making as they beat the war drums to go to war with another country, this country or that country. How does that serve the interests of the American people? What objectives are we trying to accomplish? These are the questions that are unfortunately too often not asked or answered, and that we need to change to make this a central part of the national conversation that we need to have.
Okay. Lynn's?
Hi, my name's Liz.
Hi.
I am an ACLU voter. I care a lot about civil liberties and especially ending mass incarceration in this country. So my question for you is, what would you do on the federal level to end mass incarceration?
There's a bill that we recently passed through the House of Representatives called the First Step Act, which is exactly that. It is a first step towards dealing with our broken criminal justice system and the problem that we have of this endless revolving door of those who are put into our judicial system and end up cycling throughout most of their lives. The First Step Act sought to address some of the prison reform issues to reduce those recidivism rates. The Senate is still going through changes, but some of the changes that they're making will add some of those sentencing reforms that need to be included, whether it's in this bill or the next iteration of legislation, that actually have bipartisan support. As you know, but maybe others don't know, that this is one of those issues where we have to continue to press to make these reforms, because we have the support of the ACLU, but also people like the Koch brothers are supporting this legislation. You have far left and far right, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican coming together and saying it is urgent that we make these changes for our country and for our people. We have to look at the failed war on drugs and how far too many of our brothers and sisters are being incarcerated when really what they need is treatment and help and services. I've introduced legislation to end the federal marijuana prohibition. This is one of many things that we can and must do to address the heart of the problem here, where everyday Americans are being criminalized for things that they have no business being criminalized for. It's a big topic and there's a lot of issues there, but these are some of the concrete steps that we can begin to take to start making those changes. Thank you.
Ed?
Well, for the camera.
Hi. Come on here. Why don't you come on in here for a sec so
sure.
people can see you.
I bellow from across the room.
I believe you. I believe you.
Just ask Larry. My name's Ed Cunningham from Kensington, and I'm an outsourced union worker. They closed our factory in 2007 and sent it to Mexico, then to China. Where do you stand on first trade with China and then relations, especially military relations with China?
It's a big topic, both of those.
Sorry.
Look, as we deal with the trade imbalance that we have with China and with other countries, for that matter, I would say two things. One is we need to look at how our trade relationships are impacting us here at home and our jobs and our domestic industries. And we need to have a plan to be able to get to where we need to be to strengthen our economy and to strengthen American jobs here at home. I think both of those things are not happening currently. This was one of the biggest concerns that I had around the TPP trade deal that was being negotiated and was being brought to Congress in the previous administration, that it did not take into account the impact on our domestic jobs, our American workers, or the impact on our environment, and actually had provisions that would undermine the sovereignty of our government and our ability to make decisions and enforce the laws of our own country.
By the way, I read a lot of your work.
Thank you.
For a long time. I've been watching you.
Okay. So I'm not telling you anything you don't know.
Yeah, right out there.
Yeah.
They need to know it.
As we talk about peace, and we talk about the cost of war, and as we deal with countries like China and others, we have to recognize there are consequences to ratcheting up tensions and taking adversarial positions that could lead us down a path towards another military conflict. So we have to be very careful in how we are building relationships and how we deal with the challenges that exist with China and within the region as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to take 7 more names. In the back, what's your name?
Dan.
Dan. Okay, Ken. Eileen. Okay, Tom. All right. Yes, what's your name?
Dan.
Dan. And your name?
Liam.
Okay, one more. What's your name? Okay. All right, Dan. So I think we're going to be at this. I'll get to you if we finish up with time. We're going to end at about 4:45. Okay, so Dan. Yeah, go ahead. What's your question?
Hey there.
Hi, Dan.
Thank you for coming out.
Thank you for coming out.
Speak up, Dan.
Oh, you can't hear me? I'm sorry. My interest is monetary policy, and I think that it's undermined our economy, going off the gold standard in '69, making the petrodollar deal in '74. We have a $21 trillion debt. Some people are estimating that we have $200 trillion of debt in unpaid liabilities because of all the promises the government has made to back everything up. So I think about universities and how they have endowments as opposed to debts. And the government is a nonprofit, and yet we have all this debt. And we have the Federal Reserve, who's happy to hand out money and print money for war and for welfare programs. And I wondered what your thoughts were in terms of monetary policy and debt.
I have supported an audit of the Fed, something that hasn't happened and I think needs to. You know, much of what we're talking about, and you bring up the national debt and the deficit. In the 6 years that I've been in Congress, I have watched how when it's politically advantageous to talk about the need to pay for what we are spending in this country, then it becomes a conversation and a factor. But when it's not politically advantageous and you want to push something through, then it's kind of blindly set aside, not thinking about what the impact is or how we pay for it, kicking it down the road for our young people and their children to come. I think it's a big topic to cover, and there's a lot of ideas that need to be brought to the forefront that aren't in a usual conversation like this. But as we talk about the cost of war, as we talk about the cost of education, as we talk about the cost of healthcare, I think we need to take a different approach to each of these things, looking at the many tools that we have available to us to make sure that we can use the resources that are available to provide for the needs of our people and have an economic policy that is based on the needs of our citizens, the needs of the American people, rather than the greed and selfish interest that often drives many of the policies that are taking place here. So if we come at it from that perspective, then we can have a different view, a different context on how we're looking at economic policy and where we need to go. Thank you.
Ken.
Banking off of that same issue, it seems we've been in this cyclical Republican process of incurring these toxic tax cuts that force us into recessions and increase the income gap.
Yeah.
How is that going to be dealt with?
Just raise taxes on the rich.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, look, this was the big problem with the big tax cut bill that went through that I and I think every other Democrat opposed, is that while there were marginal tax cuts that were temporary for working people, those with the most got the most tax breaks and are benefiting as a result. And the many promises that we saw were made about giving that, you know, corporations saying, well, we're going to give bonuses, we're going to do this, we're going to give people raises. Over time, once the issue has gone out of the headlines, we've seen how those promises have been broken. But we've also lived through this before, right? It's not like we don't know how this story ends. So similar to the last question, if we get money out of politics and we reshape the conversation on our economy, on the tax dollars that come into our government, and reprioritize those, then we can have a tax policy that actually works for the people rather than the very few who are making most of the decisions or behind the most of the decisions that we have in this country. This has to apply to across the board, and I'm so happy your question was the first question, because
It's the basis of everything.
it's the basis. You look at a lot of these different challenges that we're dealing with, and you start following the line of money and connecting those dots, you can get to the heart of the problem. Thank you.
Eileen.
I'm curious to know how you think the new Congress may be able to look at gun violence in this country as a medical issue, especially as it relates to children.
Well, I think certainly in the House, where we've been able to take the majority, it will be central to the debate that we will have and legislation that will be coming forward. I think the leadership of our House has already made that very clear. I think the bigger challenge still exists, though, outside of Congress, in the conversations that need to happen amongst the communities in our country, where unfortunately this issue of gun safety has become so toxic, where it's one side versus the other side, and those conversations aren't really happening much. I've been inspired to see how the kids from Parkland in Florida are doing what many others haven't done before in reaching out. And just that picture of seeing those kids going and having these conversations across the country, even as they're being protested, going and talking to those protesters and seeing, you know, what I would call aloha, have a conversation based on aloha and respect for each other, even if we disagree on an issue, because then you can find those common values that we share as people. And in order for us to pass legislation that will ultimately make people in this country more safe, that'll make our kids more safe, these are the conversations that need to happen.
Tom? Wait, Tom, there was somebody named Tom.
That would be me, I think.
Yeah, right, sorry.
Larry, how can you forget?
I know, I just did the first name, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm on the Rockingham County Dems Committee. I'm one of the people that's responsible for publicizing this event somewhat.
Thank you.
When I put up
You did a good job.
And I'd like to claim credit to everybody being here.
You did great.
When I put up the Facebook event, I was surprised. I don't know you very well, but I was surprised that I immediately got some responses from people I know as progressive activists who were concerned about some of the influences in your past that you have supported, particularly, I think, Swami Prabhu. I'm not sure I have the correct pronunciation, and a man named Chris Butler, both of whom raised issues in their minds about LGBTQ and race issues. And I fully support the idea that people can evolve and move beyond their instruction or their past influences and learn new things. But I would like to hear your response to those people. And I'd also like to hear, in a practical sense, how you might address what you know will be a ton of negative ads for anything like that in your past training.
My past training?
Instruction, learning, leadership, however you like to phrase it. Education, perhaps, is a way.
Sure. There's a few things I'd like to mention. First of all, I grew up in a very kind of conservative household, a multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-faith home, diverse in our makeup and diverse in our views, and held views growing up that I no longer hold. And throughout my life and throughout my experiences, particularly in the Middle East, during those deployments where both just as an American but also as a woman, I saw firsthand the destructive effect of having governments who act as moral arbiters for their people. And that caused me to really deeply reflect and be introspective on the values and beliefs and that I had grown up with what I was experiencing there, and then coming back and eventually running for office again, and the conflict that I saw there in standing for, believing strongly in, and fighting for these ideals of freedom and liberty that we hold dear in this country means that equality, that our laws, our government must apply that respect for every single individual, for people who choose to love or marry someone, whether they be of the same gender or not. That respect and that freedom for every woman to be able to make her own choice about her body and her family and her future. So it was a process that I went through that changed my views in many ways, and in many big ways, to the views that I hold today. And for those critics, I ask them to look at my record. I've served in Congress now for 6 years and have a strong record that reflects what I've just shared. I want to bring up the issue of religion because it is one that we have seen for too long, and we continue to see being used to foment bigotry and elicit fears and suspicions in people because of someone who holds a religion that may be different from the most. I took my oath of office on the Bhagavad Gita when I was first sworn into Congress in 2012. I'm a practicing Hindu, and my spiritual practice, my relationship with God, is something that is near and dear to my heart. Whether it is Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, Christians, atheists, whatever the path that people have chosen for their lives, it is important that every one of us stand up, call out, and condemn those who are seeking to incite bigotry based on religion for what it is, and not allow them to try to use that as a driver to divide us, because that's not who we are in this country of freedom. We cannot allow that to happen to those who may share our faith or those who may have a different faith or a different practice. We see this in politics all the time. You know, most glaringly, we saw it, we saw it with President Obama. You know, I mean, President John F. Kennedy went through this test when he ran for president, where people questioned how his Catholic faith would drive and influence his policies as a leader. So again, I think especially now, especially in this time, where we are seeing this kind of hatred and bigotry having such an influence over our politics, and how we saw devastatingly the impact of that in Pittsburgh with the shooting at the synagogue. This is what happens when this is allowed to continue without being condemned and stopped. This is where the result ends up, with people being shot and killed in their place of worship. So as we stand for peace abroad, we have to stand for peace and freedom here at home amongst our brothers and sisters, and recognize that interconnectedness and that we have to stand and speak as one. Thank you.
Dan?
So you spoke about the need.
There you are.
You spoke about the need to end the regime change wars that we have a fascination with now for decades, again, from both parties.
Yes.
And because of those wars, we have created anger and hatred towards us, towards other ethnic groups throughout our country, but also obviously throughout the world.
Yes.
In a short answer, how do you begin to heal that hatred to avoid any future kinds of wars?
That's such an important question. And the answer really isn't that long. It's by acknowledging what the United States policies have been, the pain and harm and destruction they have caused, and therefore making that change in our policy going forward. Acknowledging what has happened and who has paid the price, so that we, the American people, can recognize the problems with those policies that have been held and driven by leaders from both parties, as well as for those in other countries that you're talking about, to see that there is a better way forward for us here at home and for our place in the world. I had a meeting several months ago with some representatives from the Vatican at the UN. And I forget how the conversation went, but one observation they made was, we were actually talking about this issue of regime change wars. And they said, Tulsi, do you know the second most what was the word they used? The country that is the second most disrespected country in the UN. People have bad feelings toward.
Us.
It's the United States.
And Israel is first.
So we have to do our part here to recognize the problems with where we've been in order to fix our policies and build that better path forward. And others will recognize that, and to begin to see the opportunity for us to rebuild many of those relationships and the trust that's been broken.
Okay. Liam?
Hi, Congresswoman.
Hi.
Tell us a little bit about how you would stop foreign interference in our elections, especially from a cyber angle.
Yeah. That's a great question. I'm working on legislation that we'll be introducing in the new Congress, because I think it's important for us to look at the many different ways foreign countries try to influence our elections and to influence our policies. The one that's gotten the most attention has been, Russia's actions online and on Facebook and so on and so forth. But what's also coming to light is there have been other countries who seek to influence or infiltrate or hack into our election systems using the internet. On that, I'll address that front first. The vulnerabilities in our election system are highly recognized and talked about, and yet little to no action has been taken to harden our elections infrastructure to protect us against them. There's I think it was called the Hackers DEF CON conference in Vegas. They have every year. What is it called? Do you remember what it's called?
The Black Hat Conference.
Yeah.
The DEF CON conference as well.
Exactly. So part of that conference is dedicated to election security and the vulnerabilities within our election security system. And it made a lot of headlines. But I think it was a 14-year-old girl was able to hack into a replica of Florida's election system in less than 15 minutes. This points to the extreme vulnerabilities that we have. And the fact that we still have states in this country who have no paper backup, no paper hard copy backup to audit a vote in the event that it's hacked. I introduced a bill called the Securing America's Elections Act, which is very short and very simple and direct in saying you either use a paper ballot or you have a voter verified paper backup if you want to use an electronic system. This is something that works very well in my home state of Hawaii. Or I can go and I can look on the printed sheet of paper before I hit the button to cast my ballot to make sure everything printed there accurately reflects the choices that I've made. And therefore, if there's a question of integrity or hacking or interference in some way, you have that paper backup. Virginia is a state that recognized their vulnerabilities before their 2017 statewide elections. And rather than say, oh, you know, this is something we have to address, but, you know, it's too big of a challenge, they took action and within weeks had those paper systems in place. They came and testified before Congress on this issue and talked about how for the first time, they did not have a single complaint about the integrity of those elections since they made those changes. So this is something, especially with the many issues that we have seen just occur across the state in Florida, or across the country in Florida and in other Georgia and other states, why we have to get this right and how urgent it is. We also have to recognize how other countries are trying to influence our policies, our policymakers, and our elections. There are many countries who spend a lot of money, like Saudi Arabia, for example, who fund a lot of our foreign policy think tanks in Washington. So those who come and testify before Congress, those who put out papers talking about different issues and different foreign policies without disclosing who their funders are, so you know where their angle is, you know who is backing those efforts. That's one area. You know, there have been recent reports about reporters working for major cable networks who are funded by different countries. So we have to have this transparency, first of all, and second of all, make it so that those who are in these neutral positions are not able to take foreign money. For example, I don't believe members of Congress who leave Congress should be allowed to go and work for a foreign country. There are holes within our Foreign Agent Registration Act that have to be filled. They are very loose right now, and so you have people who, again, are trying to influence policy, and you have no idea whose interests they're actually representing. Thank you.
Okay. Bob?
Hi.
Hi.
This is Skylar. His twin brother Lucas is out there somewhere. Apologize if they've stepped on anybody. I would love to see them come of age in a time where we actually believe that healthcare is a human right and we actually enact that into law. How do we get there, though? The last time we had a chance, when President Obama came into office, he tackled healthcare as the top of his agenda, but he wasn't even willing to consider something like the public option. Since then, obviously, things have changed a lot. President Sanders' campaign has gone a long way. Now, roughly something like half of the Democratic Congress believes in a Medicare for all or a single-payer type system. First of all, what are your beliefs on a true single-payer, Medicare for all or single-payer type system? How can we get there from where we are now? And what do you see this next campaign looking like in terms of differentiation between true progressives versus people who are just going to try to say the right thing to get through this issue, but aren't true believers in terms of healthcare should be a human right with some kind of proper healthcare system like they have in so many other countries?
Yeah.
How do we get there?
I'm a co-sponsor of the Medicare for All bill in the House of Representatives. And thank you. Believe as you do that this is an urgent and pressing issue that we can't afford to wait until your children are grown up to try to address, because we still have too many people, even under the Affordable Care Act that as it exists today, are still not able to afford the care that they need, or dealing with deductibles that are too high, or getting to that moment of crisis where they need to go in and get the care that they need, but simply can't afford it. This is where Medicare for All comes in. I think, though, that we need to take it a step farther and look at the different tools that we have at our disposal to really change the way we're delivering healthcare and providing that care and making it so that it's accessible to people, focusing more on preventive care so that we are actually saving money, driving down the cost of healthcare rather than continuing to drive it up. So I really hope that we have a more comprehensive debate around how to make sure that every person in this country has access to health care and the quality of that care that's being delivered. And I think that we can do that by addressing this issue as a way that we as a country and as a people can actually save money rather than something that's going to drive us farther into debt. So I think the way that we can talk about this is one of those issues that unfortunately can sometimes be relegated to as a partisan issue, rather than as an issue that's important to every single person and their family, every single person they care about in this country. And so we've got to be able to have those conversations to move forward. And like you said, we've made a lot of progress. There's still a lot of progress to be made, but it has become a central part of the debate and the standard to which our voters will hold leaders accountable to. Thank you.
Okay, so we have time for 2 more questions. Somebody out there had a question. What's your name?
Sure, Andy.
Hi, Andy.
Andy, okay, and one more from in here. What's your name?
Nancy.
Nancy? Okay. All right, Andy, go ahead.
Hi, clearly the situation, the crisis in Syria is one of our most pressing foreign policy issues. And you've stuck your neck out and gotten some flack for trying to take a stab at the issue. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Syria is one of the many examples of how our regime change war policies have been so costly for us, for our country, and for the Syrian people, who continue to suffer greatly. We, in that war, allied with countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, and others, who, driven by not care for the Syrian people, but their desire to overthrow a regime that they were not aligned with and install someone who they could work with, which really means control. And the Syrian people have suffered as a consequence. And what they have done, and what with the United States support and assistance have done throughout that process in providing arms, equipment, funding, and training to armed militants who are either directly or indirectly allied with or members of terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, who were attacking civilians, who were killing and harming and raping and pillaging Syrian civilians, strengthening these very terrorist groups who we are fighting against still. The authorization that Congress passed since 9/11 still exists and is still being used to go after Al-Qaeda. So on the one hand, we have our military deployed to fight against Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but on the other hand, we are providing the arms and the funds that are strengthening terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and actually not going after them at all. I introduced a bill called the Stop Arming Terrorists Act to put an end to this madness. This is not how your taxpayer dollars should be used. They are making our country less safe. What to speak of continuing to escalate the pain and suffering of the Syrian people. As we go forward and things are taking a different path now in Syria, ultimately, the Syrian people need to determine and decide their future. We have seen throughout our country's history and many of the other countries where we have intervened, either militarily or through the CIA or fiscally to topple regimes that we didn't like, the negative and detrimental consequences of those policies, not just for the people of those times, but for generations to come. We cannot continue this. It is not in our interests or the interests of the people of those countries. And ultimately, while it is not a clean or quick or pretty process, ultimately it is only the people in these countries who can make those kinds of changes to their constitution, to their leaders, to form the kind of future that they want to see for themselves. On that note, though, as Syria and the Syrian people are trying to rebuild, our sanctions regime and the international sanctions regime is a huge part of the problem, where everyday business owners, small business owners, women who are trying to provide for their families, people are suffering because of they are on the receiving end of the sanctions that are in place, and it is impossible for them to begin to see how they can rebuild their economy when not a single one of them can have a bank account. It's very basic, and as we look at and this is why it's important as we look at the sanctions that our country puts on other countries around the world. We have to think through what is the objective of those sanctions and who is going to suffer as a result. Unfortunately, that's not often what happens. Our sanctions are often put in place as a mechanism to punish without thinking through what the consequences are and who pays that price. Thank you.
All right, Nancy.
Hi, I'm a public high school math teacher, and it's getting harder and harder for us to educate our students. As you know, in the state of New Hampshire, our schools are funded by our property taxes, and if you live in a property-poor town, it's really gets harder to get money. There are all these voucher programs and different things that are happening at the state and federal level, and I'm interested to know what your opinion is on public education.
That we need to provide the funding and resources that you need in order to provide the education that we've charged you with for our kids. It's really as simple as that. And the policies and the things that are being pushed to try to further erode those resources away from our public education system cannot be supported. It undermines exactly what we have charged you to do. And thank you for your service. I went in and I went in and taught a high school class in Hawaii for 2 periods one day.
It's combat.
Right. I honor you and thank you for what you do, and I know you do it because you love it. And the challenges and the obstacles that are in place, both at the local and the federal level, are things that we have to address. We have to address. My father-in-law is a public school teacher in Hawaii, and you know, we hear from him and we see him working late into many nights, grading papers. He also teaches high school students, and how much you and your colleagues do on your own time, on your own dime, because you love what you do. It is our responsibility as a country to be able to support and empower you as you are setting our next generation up for success. Thank you.
So, Congresswoman, thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts with us today. And as a memento of our appreciation, we have a 2019 calendar, Artist of the Seacoast. This is from Families First. It's a great organization providing social services. Got some beautiful artwork from the Seacoast. We'd like to give that to you.
Thank you very much. Can I give you a hug?
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for coming. The Congresswoman will be hanging around for a while to talk with you. Okay?
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, George. It was a beautiful introduction.
Thank you.
Thank you. I know.
I like taking the names. We have no organization. Oh, so far.
Nothing.
How the hell do you do it?
I got a couple of great volunteers.
Hey, good intro, man.
Well, first of all, I'm thinking through the decision that has to be made.
I mean, you just trying to kind of figure out whether you're in with both feet or not first, kind of checking to see what the reception
Yeah, you know,
is.
I'm a lot of listening, and it's been very helpful to see. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Take myself here.
Oh, yeah.
To start to feel out the support and then to see what we're going to need to actually participate. Clearly.
There was a problem somewhere.
In other words, assuming that they have a special view of the world, but you positioned it the right way. You've seen it, so you're more against it because of your experience. rather than more militaristic. I'm going to run out. I have a business card. I'm going to give it to you.
Please.
Only if you want. You're going to make it staff. So I'll be back in a couple minutes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
Hi. Thank you so much for coming. My question, my wife is Brazilian, and we're very concerned about what's just happened there.
Yes.
I hear you talk about regime change and sanctions and that sort of thing. Yet we have a regime in Brazil that appears to want to decimate the Amazon, which has worldwide consequences. How do you reconcile, foreign policy with self-determination in Brazil?
I think that we have to respect people's rights to self-determination. As it relates to our countries and policies and relationships with other countries, that's where we can try to leverage and help influence and say, no, these are not things that we can agree with or support, and use whatever leverage we have in that way. But we are not in any position, nor should we, to come in from the outside and speak for the people of Brazil and the country to say, no, we're going to take this guy out because we disagree with their approach or whatever.
Yeah, I know France has said we're not going to buy any more coffee. That sort of thing seems like a reasonable approach.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Using the leverages that we have to make a point without undermining and causing suffering for the people of those countries that ultimately want to help.
I know there's other people that want to talk. Just one more quick question.
Yes.
You talked a lot about saving the planet.
Yes.
And I'm curious about trying to build alternative energy jobs and rescuing the industrial Northeast in 2020.
Absolutely. That is a critical point, and I've introduced legislation that focuses on exactly that. Yes, we have to get off of fossil fuels, but we have to, in order to do that, we have to invest in the infrastructure for a clean, green, renewable energy economy. And that means jobs, and that means training, and that means providing that pathway forward.
I went to bed at 11 o'clock election night in 2016 when the returns from Detroit came in. So that's where we got to focus.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
And I just hope I can count on your support for the IMLS reauthorization. I don't even know what it is. It might already be done.
A good question. I don't know.
I just looked it up when I was in the other room, and I was like, I'm not sure if it's happened yet. But
I think it should be before the end of the year. I think that's the goal.
We actually did better last year. When we fought back against Trump. Actually zeroing it out. We actually got more than we did the year before.
Good.
So good job. Hopefully, George got a picture with you, and I got jealous.
Okay, all right.
I got jealous.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good to see you, and thanks for your work and your service.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I'm kind of in the trenches like the high school teacher.
Exactly.
You see all kinds of things. I haven't
little.
seen any heroin addicts come in late yet, but you're afraid that's going to happen. You see homeless people. You see,
all kinds.
It's public library.
Place of shelter for many.
It is, and free internet, which a lot of towns you can't get it. So, library's not dead.
No, good.
Take it from me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. I've wanted to meet you for such a long time. I took a trip to Maui.
Oh, nice. Yeah, of course.
I could meet you then.
Yeah.
But the volcanoes happened, so
we were a little busy.
Yeah, a little bit busy.
I'm grateful. We had a gathering on Maui actually in August. I think it was in August, right before our primary election, and Ram Dass came, and it was really wonderful to be able to see him and spend some time with him and his friends and supporters.
Yeah, it was a wonderful retreat.
Sure.
But you totally have my support, and I thank you so much for being a ray of hope.
I appreciate that very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for making the time to come tonight. Nice to meet you. Yes. Thank you. What's your name?
My name's Marie.
Marie. All right. Valerie. Nice to see you.
Tulsi, how are you?
I'm good. How are
Good.
you?
Eric Jackman.
Nice to meet you.
Comedian, Donald Trump impersonator from here in New Hampshire.
All right.
And just a big fan of yours.
Thank you.
And I want to laud you for meeting with Assad and laud you for meeting with Trump. It's one of the things I tell people when I'm pitching your potential candidacy, that you have the guts to do that. Go outside of the box and buck your party when it's the right thing to do. So there's a lot of people here, we respect that.
Thank you.
And I respect it. So if you do run, I'm seriously considering supporting you, because I think you'll do those same kind of things, you know, when you run for office and possibly become president.
Progressive wing of the
Hampshire
Democrats.
I got it.
So can I get a picture with you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah.
Thank you
Have
very
your
much.
people call my people.
I'll do that. Thank you.
Okay, here we go. One more for posterity. Okay. Can I get a quick photo with you too, Congresswoman? Yeah, we're twin brothers.
I was
nice to
gonna
meet
say.
you. Nice to meet you. I'm Mike.
Nice
Thanks for
to meet
coming.
you, Mike.
Really, really
Thank
appreciate your speech and what you had to say. Absolutely.
Awesome.
Let me give you one of my cards.
Mike and Eric, right?
Yep. It's me all in character. You were awesome on Rogan. Did Rogan try and get you to do a bong hit?
No, he
Come on,
didn't.
Tulsi, hit this.
No, he didn't.
Hit
I
this,
fully
Tulsi.
expected him to.
I was thinking he was going to do that.
But he didn't. Not at all.
And did Trump offer you a Diet Coke?
No.
Tulsi, what do you want? You want a Coke? You want a Diet Coke? What do you think? But seriously,
That's scary good, man.
That must have been surreal meeting with him at Trump Tower. What was that like?
It was, yeah, it was interesting. I didn't know what to expect going in, but it actually ended up being a substantive foreign policy discussion.
How long did you meet with him for?
Close to an hour.
And did Bannon help set that up?
There were some other people who reached out to my team that brought the whole thing together.
Well, I applaud you for meeting with him. I think that was awesome.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric.
So thank you.
Nice to meet you guys. Thank you.
We'll see you again soon.
Aloha.
Yeah, aloha.
Aloha to you.
We'll see you again. Take care. Safe travels to you.
I met you a couple of years ago coming out of Carol Shea Porter's office.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you remember? Well, you wouldn't remember that.
I don't, but
Well,
this piqued my attention.
You know these folks,
of course,
right?
Very
okay.
well.
The
We've got a
trio
great
works.
group in Hawaii
Good.
that we often see.
I know. I'm sorry education was about the last question. There's so many
It's
other
such an
things.
integral.
I'm so glad you're here. Keep up the fight. Learn about New Hampshire. That'll be important. The
Exactly.
education question, the
Exactly.
funding and the tax and all that, it's unusual. It'll be
Yeah,
good
I've
to
been
know.
hearing a lot about that.
Good.
Thank you very much.
So Hawaiians are supposed to give gifts, I'm told.
All right,
so.
you got it. Thank you very much. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Congressman.
How are
Liam
you?
Sullivan, disabled vet.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you for yours.
Thank you for coming.
You have a friend here.
Thank you.
So if you ever want to talk technology protection, I'm their top analyst.
Awesome.
So I do all the foreign technology protection plans for the government.
Okay.
So
very good.
I got my class and my class email on there.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the best way.
Yep.
Cool.
Thank you so much. Please
Thank you
run.
for your question.
Of course.
We can't have faith and trust in our democracy if we don't have faith in our elections.
I knew that would be a softball one for you.
Yeah. Thank
Take
you.
care. Thank you so
nice
much.
to meet you, Liam. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I
Thank you
was
for coming.
in Vermont yesterday with the gathering.
Yeah.
And it's so
Wasn't
good.
it inspiring?
And it's so good to see you today. And you know, in the positive talk.
Yeah.
It's what
It's where we
everybody
need to
needs.
go. Absolutely.
There is no other
That's what I
way.
liked about the whole conference is there was so much. It was forward looking.
I'm from Brazil.
Ah, okay.
And
Did
we
I just meet your husband a few minutes?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
cool.
And we just went through the general election, and I dodged that run against it. He was awesome.
I heard. I
and
missed his talk.
He's
but-
awesome.
Yeah.
He's a wonderful guy, and
Yeah.
it was just great. But keep at it.
I will. I have to tell you, since I was a teenager, I have played capoeira for many, many years. Exactly.
It's awesome.
There's a lot of
It has
Brazilians
to
in
do-
Hawaii, and everywhere I've gone, I usually try to look up and see where are they doing capoeira because I always like to get out and play.
It has
Yeah.
the move, kind of.
Yeah. Because I've never been to Brazil, but I fell in love with the people and the culture, the music, and everything.
Yeah, I'm trying to do a lot here to help them there to go through those 4 years.
Yeah.
Because it's gonna be very, very devastating. Yeah. Especially when we talk about Amazon.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not saying that, but it's like everything. The way he ran his campaign, his policies, everything is exactly Trump.
Yeah.
The only difference, one is orange, another one is gray. But other than that, it's like, it's almost like I'm watching this coming. And, I can't do anything to stop, but I'm trying to raise some money to help independent reporters to keep in Brazil, to give accurate what's going on, and trying to do as much as I can.
It's got to help. I talked. Danny Glover's wife is Brazilian.
Is she
and he said that she was she's a professor there, and she has been a part of the whole campaign there, and she's still there.
Yeah,
doing the same thing that you're doing, seeing how can they best equip themselves
to help themselves, those poor oceans.
Yeah.
And Amazon, it's everything that we have for now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So nice to meet you. Blessed.
Thank you for coming.
All right.
Nice to see you.
All right.
Not to interrupt.
Hi. Yes.
Maggie Hassan.
Yes.
The
Okay.
senator.
Yeah.
That's all. She was a governor, U.S. senator now, and state senator from here.
Yeah.
This is Maggie,
Okay,
and we
got
love
it.
Carol, and we hope you get to meet Chris Pappas.
Yes. Good. Nice to see you.
Really
Sorry you didn't get your question.
That was all that it was.
Okay,
Just
good.
honor Carol Shea Porter, and now Chris Pappas coming in.
I haven't met him yet. Look forward to meeting him though.
Hope you get to work with him.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Sign on to House Bill 1. Yeah.
These are two elected officials.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.
State rep.
Thank you very, very much. We really appreciate it.
It's great to meet
Remember
you.
the Board of Selectmen right here.
Yes, and
This is like people
Local
like it's
government.
developed.
Also Emily's list.
And
I
you-
work
yeah.
on Emily.
And you
she's
want to
our
be in a
Emily's
picture
list.
with her.
Yes. Liz
And
How are you, Liz?
newly
elected.
elected,
Yes,
worked
thank
her
you.
butt off,
Yep.
did 3 passes of her term.
Yes.
Go.
Yep.
Yeah, so can we get a picture with
Yeah,
you?
please.
Yes.
I'd love to.
Thank you.
Everybody in?
Thank you for coming.
I got you guys.
Wait.
There we go.
Nice.
Okay, look this way, Liz. Hey, Liz. Over here. Over here, Liz. Okay. There we are.
Right here. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Good luck with everything. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, we got to work to get it through.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Nice to meet you. Hi, I'm from Derry. My name is Sean Cohen, and I actually ran for state rep this past time. I did run again in 2020. My issue is, my big issue is water and clean water. I am in a situation myself where my house had fracked well, and I got very sick from it. And so I really am concerned about issues of, fracking and controlling the way in which our water and our land is being regulated and controlled. And do you have any plans, for what you'd like to see happen in terms of helping people solve their environmental issues in their states?
Yes, I mean we have to. I think there's two sides to this. One is putting at the forefront the need to protect our water and to have the infrastructure in place to do that.
Right.
I just gave a talk about this yesterday, reminding us all that the most fundamental rights that every single one of us has is the right to clean air and clean water.
Yes.
Things that we cannot survive without.
Yes, that's like the primary thing.
Exactly.
I believe from that you can have a conversation around how you do that.
Yes.
But when you don't have that principle established, then everybody starts saying, what about the economy? What about this? What about that? Rather than looking at the central issue. We can't survive.
You can't have an economy or jobs or anything unless you have clean water and clean air.
Yeah, it needs to be the starting point.
It needs to be the starting point. Exactly. This is one of the main things that got me involved with politics in the first place. Because in Hawaii there was a push when I was a teenager. I forget how old I was, but there was a big developer and a guy who was very influential politically trying to build a landfill over one of our biggest water aquifers in the state. That very clearly would make it more likely than not that at some point that aquifer would become contaminated and therefore unable to be used, maybe for a generation or two.
Right.
And that would leave us in an island state with really being left with the only option of flying, shipping bottled water in for our people. So this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart. We've got to be able to push legislation and policies that deal with the protection of air and water, the basics that we need, as well as investing in an economy and jobs that are not so reliant on whether it's natural gas or fossil fuels or any of these other industries in our country that are contaminating our water.
Yeah, I'm so unbelievably impressed. I really am supportive of that. That's like my primary cause for why I get into politics, and I think that's a very excellent stance you have. And I hope to hear more about how we're going to be able to do that together. Like I'm going to be going into this organizational meeting next week on 350 New Hampshire, which is everywhere in every state has an organization. And we're going to talk about.
We work with them a lot, the national.
And so we're going to talk about legislation coming up in this next year.
Great.
So I'm just looking for an overall kind of messaging that would work and how kind of galvanize that message that we really want to push through people. Why it's so important.
I think you're on it.
Yeah.
You know, there's debates around climate change and all these other things, and unfortunately they've become so polarized.
Yeah.
But if you break it down to what is necessary for every single person,
water is life.
Water is life.
Jewish tradition.
Exactly.
So I do believe that. I really am very impressed.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, happy Hanukkah.
Thank you. Thank you.
There we go.
Oh, could you take a picture? I can. That would be great. Yeah, whatever fits.
That's a nice picture. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Please
much.
keep it up.
I will. Thank you.
Appreciate it. I would love to. Please. Thank you again. What a great.
Smile like that, we're doing here.
Yeah, good. You realize when I invited you, it was for 2019.
Yep.
2019.
Yep.
This is still 2018.
Yep.
We got to get you back again. Actually, into Plasta, I was supposed to Exeter.
Yes.
But
We'll make it happen.
But I'm very impressed today. Very psyched.
Thank you.
And,
well, thanks for following through. For your kind introduction.
Hopefully I got it right. And,
you got it all right?
Well, whenever you need the intro in town, let me know. Yeah, Caitlin can get a hold of me.
Perfect. Thank you.
Fantastic.
See you soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have a good night.
Thanks a lot.
I think your photographer wants to know.
Oh, okay. Sorry, George. One more. One more, if you don't mind.
Which is? Jeez.
Somebody likes the camera.
Yeah, I know.
Hey, George, could you take a picture for me?
Oh, sure.
Can we step in with Larry?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
All right.
Incidentally, some surfing about 10 miles from here.
Are you serious?
There were about 8 or 9 people out yesterday afternoon
No
in the cold.
kidding. It's cold. I didn't know there was that good surf out here. Thank you for the question. Which one is Skylar? All right. Get in here, Jordan. Get in here a little closer. There we go.
A service person to be thankful for her service.
Yeah, a couple.
And there's a student that I know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Want to check it, Bob? Just
Thanks for your question. Appreciate it.
it.
There we go.
I just wanted to, oh my goodness, getting everybody all riled up. I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Spending some time with us.
Of course. It's people like you that we need.
We need people like you together to do what we need to do.
And I'm there.
All right.
Awesome.
Thank
Can
you.
I grab a picture?
Absolutely. I love your pendant.
Oh, thanks.
Do you want to do a selfie?
I'm not very good at it, but we
It's all
can
right.
try.
We can make it work. There we go.
Awesome.
You
Thank
got
you.
it. Thank you very much. Hi.
Hi, I just want to thank you so much for your commitment. My name is Jane Sanders, but I'm not related to Bernie. But I did you came to my attention when you made your move to help Bernie's campaign. That took courage, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
And
it's the right thing to do then.
Yes,
Right thing to do now.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. So I had to come today.
I appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, I'm so glad that I did.
Good.
And
Well,
to
nice
get
to
to
meet
actually
you.
meet you too.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
safe travels.
I know another Jane.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hi.
Thank you for coming to New Hampshire.
Thank you.
I'm also in Haiku, Maui.
Oh, no
so
kidding.
I follow you out there as well. So you're
How
doing
often
great
do
things.
you?
Right after Christmas, I'm out there until I come back.
Till it gets warm.
April, May.
Yeah.
I can't get to the windows here anymore.
Haiku
But
is
you're doing
beautiful.
great work.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Aloha. Hi.
Tulsi. Mike Schroth. I'm from Massachusetts, just not far from here.
Very cool.
And no, I thank you for being open-minded and not, and you know, going to visit the place. You look for proof for things that you just aren't told. Maybe that I'd like to know a little bit about your being a Hawaiian, and that might, you know, I know about a little bit of the history and how the United States took it over and such. And you must have people in your family who might be, you know, might have been opposed to that, and so there's some things there, you know. So I mean, you might have a little bit of fighter in you there
For a whole number of reasons.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it comes down to what I talked about: knowing and understanding my purpose and who I'm fighting for, and understanding what's at stake and not taking these decisions lightly.
Yeah, and Hawaii is such a beautiful place.
It's so special.
You know, I've never been there, but I'm going.
You gotta
one of
go.
these days.
You gotta go.
And I'm going to get a picture of you while you're still young. Okay. And I'm still alive.
Do you wanna do a selfie or ask somebody to help?
Maybe we'll ask somebody to help
right,
here.
there you go.
can do that. Okay, that'd be great.
Awesome.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
And Ron Paul mentions you once in a while. I love that guy.
I've heard that.
He's like,
I've heard that.
stop intervening everywhere. I love that. Okay, thanks.
He's been saying that for a long time.
And you know what? It's going to, someday people are all going to say, yeah, that's the right thing.
Yeah,
That's
exactly. Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. I'm curious how you would instruct your administration to make decisions.
How
you would instruct your administration to make decisions. I mean, there's a lot of policies stances you'll take now, obviously, but things presumably will be a bit different in 2+ years, and issues come up all the time. So, what process do you go through? And
broadly, this is something that I have created the context for with my team that I have now in Washington, and I think is generally the way that we should look at things is how do these policies affect people? Does it help people or does it hurt people? And when we look at it through those lenses, then you get a lot more clarity on who you're working for and what your purpose is, what our purpose is as people who are elected to serve those in our constituencies. So it helps to take away a lot of the muck and the noise when you know that that's really what it's all about.
Excellent. I'm also a decision analyst, so I'm curious kind of from a process perspective as well.
Yeah.
Kind of how you go about going from an issue coming up in a sort of a problem statement to getting to an actual legislative act or administrative policy.
I think, you know, and just to go a layer deeper on these issues that come forward, I think too often they become partisan issues where if there's a D next to it, Democrats will vote for it. If there's an R, they'll vote against it, and vice versa. And the people end up losing out in that process because good ideas are not partisan. And so on the votes that we have, on the bills that come before us, what I do and what I ask my team to do is to put forward kind of both sides or all sides and what they're saying and why and who's supporting these issues. And that can create the more full perspective to understand an issue in a complete way rather than just listening to those who I may agree with.
And then how do you pick between those?
Is this going to help people or is it going to hurt people?
Okay.
That's what it comes down to.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it. Can I give you a hug? Sure. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks for speaking up. Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's one you'll never get anywhere else because the commands change.
Wow.
But one of my other passions, my education is oceanography and the origin and environment and energy and climate.
Yeah.
And I became a typhoon forecaster when I was living in Hawaii.
Wow.
The Philippines is when I went through my first super typhoons.
Wow. Wow.
Which maybe dates me.
Yeah.
but that was my command, although that was the East Coast.
Did you say you were command master chief?
I was a Navy captain.
Oh, you were? Okay, okay.
It was on, and I like your simple approach to things. I was, I think my second time in the Pentagon, I was on Admiral Lockley's pushing us there. And, you know, if therere's some big issue came up.
He was in PACOM or?
No, but when he was at director of the Navy staff, and I'd worked with Admiral Harvey and then Admiral Lockley to stay with him. And then he went to Italy and then he went to Hawaii. And but if there's something was complicated and people were talking and talking, he would say, okay, does this make me happy or does it make me sad?
That's funny.
It was perfect.
Yeah.
My God. Yeah. And if that's what it boiled down
That's a good
to.
measure.
So,
Yeah.
always like that.
I hope they answered honestly.
Most people did. So, but I just always appreciated what you did with integrity, stepping down from the DNC. Thank you. With Bernie, with going to Syria, being on everyone from Fox to Jimmy Dore, being willing to talk to Trump. Although I know whatever happened to him to make him change his ways, I'm sure it's beyond him. But I don't know. I think my brother worked really closely with Dennis Kucinich. And I think he was actually trying. I was like, maybe I should see.
Is he here or where is he?
My brother? No. He's actually, I don't know where he is, overseas somewhere.
Oh, okay, okay.
So he's not military.
Oh, okay.
He worked in Libya, in a lot of programs for a long time. He helped start computer science education. He was working solar projects, all kinds of stuff. And so there's a long history that actually Dennis was trying to set up a meeting between us some point a couple years ago, and then things got crazy and I kind of dropped it. But, you know, if there's ever opportunity.
Well, he's a good friend.
I would love to be able to talk to you.
Okay.
Things that still affect us all from that.
Well, if you want to give your information or get Caitlin's information from my team.
Okay. And I can say I'm the crazy lady that gave you the coin with the hurricane flags.
Lady. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
Hi. I just wanted to say hi. My name is Bonnie Wright. I've been sailing. I'm very active and involved. I ran for state rep. Awesome. And I just wanted to share on the back. I heard that you talked. I was late getting here. I heard you talked a lot about love. On the back of my palm card that I handed out when I was campaigning, making the world kind again, one hug at a time. So may I?
So it's meant to be.
Thank you.
Thank
I
you
look forward
very
to
much.
seeing you, hearing you. I've missed several opportunities to meet you before, Rights and Democracy.